Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know we love to unpack the most talked about stories, and today we're diving headfirst into the wild world of election politics. Specifically, former President Trump's recent comments about early voting. You sent us this article titled, "Early Voting is a Scam. Trump rails against early voting at Michigan rally as early voting begins." Anyway, so let's break this down. This article takes us straight to a Michigan rally where Trump is slamming early voting, calling it a disgrace and a scam. He even goes as far as to say that it's a tactic that Democrats use to, steal votes. And the kicker is this is all happening as early voting kicks off in Michigan, a state that, as you all know, played a pretty pivotal role in the 2020 election.
Yeah, the timing here is really something. You have to remember, one of the reasons Trump lost in 2020 was because Democrats were so effective at using early and mail-in voting. So this attack on early voting right when it starts feels very, very intentional, almost like he's trying to get ahead of the story.
Yeah, like he's planting seeds of doubt before things even get going. But what I find really interesting is the argument itself. Trump saying that early voting doesn't give voters enough time to really evaluate the candidates or their platforms.
That's a good point. It kind of implies that voters aren't capable of making up their minds early on. But then again, is he hinting at some big October surprise that's going to change the whole race? Even though, let's be honest, he's running on a pretty similar platform to before.
It's like he's saying, don't vote yet, folks. Something huge is going to happen. But he never actually says what that huge thing is. And the article points out how ironic it is that Trump, someone who's been in the public eye for decades, is saying voters don't know enough about him.
That does make you wonder. Maybe his issue with early voting isn't about voters being informed at all. Maybe it's more about controlling how people see the election, maybe even setting things up so he can dispute the results again like he did in 2020.
The article calls this Trump's perpetual grievance tour, turning every single event into a chance to air his complaints. And this time, early voting seems to be the target.
Right, and this fits a pattern we've seen from Trump since 2016, this idea that the entire system is rigged against him. And what's concerning is that this constant message, despite, evidence to the contrary, could actually erode public trust in democracy. It makes you question the long-term impact on people's confidence in elections.
And it's not just talk. The article says Trump is actively discouraging his supporters from voting early, even though, ironically, that strategy might have contributed to his loss in 2020.
It's a puzzling move. We know that early voting increases voter turnout and lets campaigns see how they're doing. By discouraging it, he might actually be hurting his own campaign.
It's almost like he's playing chess, but he keeps making moves that help his opponent. The article also looks at the demographics of early voters, pointing out that it's often busy working-class individuals and seniors who vote early, key demographics for Trump, telling them to wait until Election Day could really backfire.
That's a big point. Trump claims to be a champion for the forgotten man, but this strategy could actually prevent some of those people from voting. It makes you wonder, is this about principle, strategy, or something else entirely?
Maybe a bit of all three. But the article goes even further. It shows how this whole situation affects the Republican Party as a whole. Historically, Republicans have used early voting to their advantage, but Trump's rhetoric has changed the party's stance, which could hurt their chances.
This is where it gets really interesting. You can see the tension within the GOP, trying to keep Trump's base happy while also appealing to moderate and independent voters who see early voting as a convenient option. Finding that balance is a tough thing to do.
And then the article gets a little bit darker. It ends by suggesting that Trump's campaign against early voting could be a way to explain away a potential loss, like he's casting doubt on the system before the results even come in.
That's a really thought-provoking idea. Whether it's intentional or not, this kind of talk could really erode public trust in the whole democratic process, and the impact of that could last long after this election is over.
It's almost like he's creating a scenario where if he wins, it's legitimate. But if he loses, it's because the system was rigged against him.
Exactly. So we've talked about how Trump's words could damage people's trust in elections, but what's really interesting is how it might affect his own supporters.
You're right. The article says that by telling people not to vote early, Trump might actually be hurting his own campaign.
Yeah, it seems kind of backwards, but it's true. Early voting, especially these days, has become a really important tool for both parties to get people to vote. And traditionally, Republicans have been really good at using it.
It's strange, right? Because early voting is supposed to make voting easier, especially for people who might have trouble getting to the polls on Election Day. Think about people who live in rural areas or people with disabilities or people with jobs that make it hard to get away.
Exactly. And those are often the same groups of people who support Trump. By telling them to wait until Election Day, he's basically making it harder for some of his most loyal voters to vote.
It's like he's more worried about saying the system is rigged than he is about making sure his supporters' votes actually get counted. The article even points out how ironic it is that he says he wants every vote to count, but then discourages a method that could increase voter turnout.
It makes you wonder what his real goals are. Is he really worried about early voting, or is he just trying to create a story that helps him no matter what happens?
The article seems to suggest that this whole anti-early voting thing could be a way for him to explain away a loss if he doesn't win. By making people doubt the system beforehand, he's giving himself someone to blame if things don't go his way.
It's a cynical way to look at it, but it does fit with how he's acted in the past. Remember, he said similar things about the system being rigged in 2016, even though he won that election. This isn't a new strategy for him.
So what does this mean for the 2024 election, and even beyond? The article says that this kind of talk might end up hurting Trump in the long run, especially as early voting becomes more popular and people get used to it.
I think that's a real possibility. As more voters, including Republicans and independents, start using early voting because it's convenient, Trump's message might not work anymore.
It's like he's trying to fight against something that's already happening. And this brings us to another point the article makes about how this affects the whole Republican Party. By sticking with this anti-early voting stance, they risk alienating a growing number of voters.
You're absolutely right. This strategy could have consequences for the party in future elections. It's a gamble, and it's not clear if it'll pay off.
So we've talked about Trump's claims and his possible motives and the potential consequences. But let's bring this back to you, the listener. Why should you care about all of this?
That's a great question. This whole deep dive into Trump's attack on early voting isn't just about one candidate or one election. It shows how people can use words to change how others see our democratic processes.
It reminds us that we all have a responsibility to protect our democracy. And that starts with being informed, thinking critically, and making our voices heard through our votes.
Absolutely. No matter who you support or who you plan to vote for, it's so important to be aware of how people try to influence your vote and to be skeptical of those tactics.
Don't just believe what someone says, even if you like them or agree with them. Do your own research, check the facts, and come to your own conclusions.
That's what it means to be an informed citizen. In a world where there's so much information and political spin, critical thinking and having real conversations are more important than ever.
So as we finish up this part of our deep dive, we encourage you to keep learning about these issues, talk to your friends and family, and make your vote count, whether you vote early or on Election Day.
Remember, a healthy democracy needs citizens who are informed and engaged. Now, before we move on, there's one more interesting thing. The article talked about the history of early voting and how it's changed over time.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Trump's campaign against early voting. It's been quite a ride.
Yeah, it has. We've gone from Trump claiming the system is rigged to how his words could actually hurt his own campaign and the Republican Party.
And we talked about how important it is to think critically and participate in our democracy. But before we wrap up, I wanted to go back to something the article mentioned about the history of early voting and how it's changed over time.
That's a really interesting point that often gets overlooked. Early voting wasn't always this common. It used to be much more limited, mainly for people who couldn't physically get to the polls on Election Day.
It was the exception, not the rule. But the article explains how that's all changed recently, with more states making early voting easier.
Right. A few things have caused this shift, like wanting to increase voter turnout, make Election Day less chaotic, and just give voters more flexibility in their busy lives.
It seems like a pretty logical approach, right? Making it easier for people to vote.
Totally. And what's interesting is that expanding early voting has usually had support from both parties. Democrats and Republicans have both supported making voting more accessible.
Which makes Trump's position even more confusing.
Yeah.
He's basically trying to make people think a system that both parties have accepted for a long time is bad.
It makes you wonder why he's so focused on this one part of voting. Is it just strategy, or is there something else going on?
The article suggests that maybe Trump just doesn't understand how early voting works. He seems to think it gives one party an advantage, when really it's just about making voting more convenient for everyone.
That's a good point. It shows how important it is to get the facts before you form an opinion. Trump's claims about early voting being a scam just aren't true, and they go against what tons of voters and election officials all over the country have experienced.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, we're left with a mix of worry and hope. Worry about how misinformation and divisive rhetoric can damage our democracy.
but also hope that voters will see through those tactics and choose fairness, transparency, and participation, which are so important for a healthy electoral system.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, this deep dive is just the beginning. We encourage you to keep learning about these issues, talking to your friends and family, and making your voice heard in a way that reflects your values and what you know to be true.
Exactly. The more we have respectful conversations and informed debates, the stronger our democracy becomes.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep diving deep.